Mrs Mayne, thank you. Can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this debate? It's a very technical subject, but it's one that's hugely important to a number of constituents, whether it be in the large tragedies involving the multiple loss of human life or in a single tragedy of a baby through to adulthood. And I pay tribute to the kind words to my honourable friend, the member for Banbury, as well, on the whole subject of my private member's bill, now an act, which will enable coroners to have the power to launch inquests into stillbirths. The consultation, which has already been launched by the Ministry for Justice, will explore the whole issue around legal aid for those inquests as well. It's very important that we get the consultation right so that this very sensitive area can be brought in proportionately and appropriately and help in the campaign that we all wish well to reduce the number of stillbirths in this country and to explain to already traumatised and grieving parents exactly what happened and how improvements can be made to the system to try and make sure that it's less likely to happen to other parents in that situation in the future. Indeed.
In addition to that, would he support legal aid for people who are killed at work? It's not available for the many people who die in fatal accidents every year in work.
Well, that's a completely different subject, and I think again that needs to be looked at. Absolutely, I'm sympathetic to this, because I think when families faced with the sudden loss of a loved one through circumstances that are well beyond their control, be it in a workplace, be it in an air crash or whatever, then we need to give them every support and not to add challenges such as trying to find the money to fund lawyers to try to get to the basis of the truth. So I'm sympathetic with what she says. But I wanted to focus here, Mrs Mayne, purely on the Shoreham Airshow crash, which happened in my constituency back on that fateful summer's day in August of 2015, where 11 Sussex men were tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time and lost their lives. And almost 4 years on, we have still not had the inquest to that tragedy. And that delay for a whole range of issues, not least the fact that there has now been a trial, which was completed last month, has meant that the families of those 11 men have been denied getting to the bottom of the truth for an extended period, thereby compounding the grief and the confusion and the challenges that they have felt. And we need to do more to make their pain less in any way we can. And the system is not working for people like that, as we've heard many examples from other tragedies as well. But just to recap, Mrs Mayne, in August of 2015, those 11 men lost their lives when a Hawker jet crashed on the A27, on the very spot that, in fact, I had been travelling in my car just 4 minutes before the accident happened. It could have been a much, much more serious tragedy. As it was the largest civilian loss of life since the London terrorist attack in 2005. It had a huge impact not only on those families directly affected, but by the wider community of my constituency and beyond, which still remembers and is in the process of installing at the moment a permanent memorial to the loss of life of that tragedy. The pilot was acquitted. I make no comment about that, other than to say that those families who sat through that trial, and I joined them at the beginning of the trial and at the end of the trial, with great dignity, listening to lurid details of exactly what happened, looking at the footage taken from people's mobile phones of the plane coming down, with great dignity, sat through that trial and then had to accept a verdict that they did not want and had not expected. But justice went through its due courses. I make no criticism of that. But it does mean that the inquest, which had to wait until the trial was completed, is now even more important for those families to try and flush out, well, who was responsible? Are there parties who actually contributed in some way to that accident happening? And most importantly, what is being done to try and minimise the likelihood of any such accident happening again in the future. And let's remember, Mrs. Mayne, the record of civil aviation shows was virtually unblemished in this country. There had been no on-the-ground casualties since the Aldershot, the Farnborough tragedy back in the 1950s. So this was a huge and important event, well beyond the impact of the local community and the families themselves. And I want to pay tribute to the local coroner for West Sussex, Penny Schofield, who has worked tirelessly with the families to try and manage their expectations and trying to be as sensitive as possible about their continuing grief. But what has compounded their grief has been the issue of legal aid, which I know Mrs. Mayne wants me to come on to, which is the focus of what I'm now going to say, but I wanted to put it into context, as I'm sure Mrs. Mayne appreciates. The inquest is now likely to happen in the autumn. It'll be over 4 years since the tragedy took place. At the last count, there will be at least 19 interested parties to that inquest, involving a number of public bodies such as Sussex Police, the Civil Aviation Authority, the Air Accident Investigation Branch, Health and Safety Executive, who will have legal representation paid for out of the public purse. As it stood until recently, and is still not being confirmed, the only parties who will not have legal representation paid for at that inquest will be the families of those 11 victims. So arguably the people most important, with the greatest interest in those proceedings, will not, as it stood, have legal representation at that inquest. And that is a travesty of justice, Mrs. Mayne, and I have mentioned it and had a debate explicitly on that subject in this chamber before. And I've spoken to the Minister about it. I've raised it at Prime Minister's question time. I've worked with the families and with the lawyers acting for the families. The system is not working as it stands. Now, there was a bid to the Legal Aid Agency back in 2017, to the Exceptional Cases Fund, to get legal representation paid for this inquest. But it was turned down on the basis that somehow it was not in the scope of the Exceptional Cases funding and that it did not represent a wider public interest. It's quite extraordinary, Mrs. Mayne, because what I learned during this whole process is that civilian air shows have the second largest public audience of any activity in this country. There is a huge public, wider interest for the many hundreds of air shows that happen up and down this country each year. And despite clear evidence within the AIB's report, which was published back in March 2017, where it said, for example, the parties involved in the planning, conduct and regulatory oversight of the flying display did not have formal safety management systems in place to identify and manage the hazards and risks. There was a lack of clarity about who owned which risk and who was responsible for the safety of the flying display. That controls intended to protect the public from the hazards of displaying aircraft were ineffective, and that there was a valid, proper and serious legal argument that the CAA failed as a regulator in properly implementing safety recommendations made over 6 years by the AAIB from a previous fatal Hawker crash. If that doesn't represent wider public interest, Mrs. Mayne, I don't know what does. And as the coroner herself has said, absolutely in support of making sure there is legal aid to pay for legal representations for those families when the case comes in front of her at the inquest. She said, this is a highly complicated case. It involves areas of aviation law which are complex and technical in nature. Families will struggle to participate in the inquest in any meaningful way without the assistance of legal representation. The inquest will engage a number of complex legal issues, including Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, further complicated by the fact that the inquest will be sitting with the jury. And if the families are not represented, it is likely that the inquest, which is already likely to last up to 8 weeks, will take considerably longer. These are the words of the coroner. And what she's actually saying is not only is it not fair for the families not to have legal representation when all these other public bodies have, but it will be really difficult for the families to participate and assimilate the proceedings of that inquest properly without legal experts there to be able to put it to them. And it could actually end up costing more. Because if we provide a legal expert to represent all the families as a whole, it will make proceedings go more efficiently. If the families look to have legal representation themselves, or even represent themselves, it is absolutely going to spin out that inquest and cost the public purse more. This is entirely a false economy by not making sure that legal aid is available for those families. So that is the coroner herself speaking about the inquest which is going to come in front of her. And there have been papers produced by the lawyers acting for the families just showing how essential it is that family members have legal representation which must be provided by the public purse at that inquest. So, Mrs Mayne, the decision by the Legal Aid Agency not to permit funding under the exceptional cases funding provisions introduced in the LASPO Act of 2013 is patently wrong and unjust. Exceptional case funding is currently available for categories of law which are not in scope for legal aid, and where failure to provide legal services will be in breach of an individual's rights within the meaning of the Human Rights Act or other enforceable EU rights relating to provision of local legal services. Yet inquests have never fallen within the main body of legal aid provision. Currently, legal aid for inquests is only available at the discretion of the Legal Aid Agency under the exceptional case funding provisions introduced in the LASPO Act in April 2013, as I've said. So this is just the sort of eventuality, just the sort of case that was envisaged when setting up the fund in the original LASPO Act. It's nothing to do with cuts in legal aid funding, as some have tried to claim. It's actually about provisions in the original legislation for just this sort of eventuality, now apparently not working. The Law Society itself, Mrs Mayne, has supported this application and strongly believes that bereaved families should have access to legal representation where possible. And as they have put it, the current definition of exceptional cases funding does not provide an adequate safety net for inquests. Applications for exceptional funding are highly complex and time-consuming, requiring applicants to have an understanding of human rights law and, in the case of inquests, to be able to show that there is an Article 2 right of life issue or a wider public interest in legal aid being granted. Even where one of these triggers is present, the Legal Aid Agency guidance suggests that the assumption should still be that the bereaved family does not need representation because the process is an inquisitorial one led by the coroner rather than an adversarial one. However, the Law Society would challenge how far a bereaved family can be expected to engage effectively with a legal process relating to the death of a loved one. So, in conclusion, Mrs Mayne, I do want to pay tribute to the legal firm Stewart's Law, who are providing a lot of support, largely pro bono, to the families. They have challenged this ruling. Unofficially, we are optimistic that legal aid funding may be available when the inquest comes around. But effectively, they should not have had to fight for it. It should have been there as a matter of course, and actually as was intended in the original legislation in 2013. But this inequality of arms is inequitable and could undermine the inquest's ability to serve the public interest by failing to protect the rights of the families under ECHR Article 2. And there is clearly a wider public interest. So, finally, I welcome the recently announced government review, which the Minister published, of the LASPO Act. But it's still not clear from that review about the future of exceptional cases funding. And so I would urge her that in the response to that review, we do need to look further and in more detail, and she may care to comment in her winding up, to make sure that when tragedies like the Shoreham Airshow disaster happen, and in many other applications that we've heard about on a multiple loss of life or on a single loss of life, that the system automatically swings in to support those families, rather than to put yet further hurdles in the way of them securing justice and access to the truth, which only exacerbates the trauma and the tragedy and the grief they are already funding. Surely we owe it to those people who have been unfortunate enough to suffer such loss that we should do everything to support them, not to put obstacles in their way.